last fall, I hope you can see this. I'm going to try to make it as unnecessary as possible for you to see what's on the screen. Last fall, as Eric said, I walked a 500-mile trail across northern Spain. My friend and I stopped pretty frequently just to enjoy the beauty of what we were seeing. And when I came back, I kind of promised myself that I would really focus on doing what I could to keep this world beautiful. I'm part of Riverwood Council. There's a bunch of us here today, which works to protect the natural spaces in our area. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. I also coordinate a hiking club, as Eric said, and the idea is there to sort of help people get out in nature. And this talk is kind of an extension of those activities. I'm not a historian. I'm going to apologize in advance for any errors I make. I don't think any of the like dates errors or whatever that I make are going to be critical. The overall point will be pretty clear. So Eric asked me to talk about the history of trails in our area, and I kind of thought there's not enough meat in that. And so I thought about it for a while and decided, there's a lot of other sort of threads of history that are connected to this. So I looked at a whole bunch of things, went down a whole bunch of rabbit holes, and what you're going to see is there's a little bit of jumping around, but I hope you find it all connects together. So it looks at the history of work, of transportation, something about culture, a little bit of social justice and environmentalism, and they all sort of have something to do with hiking and why we like to walk. So humans started walking erect 3 million years ago in Africa. In fact, it's walking on two legs is a fundamental characteristic of human beings. Climate change, which will come up a couple of times here, caused droughts where the first humans were, and they were forced to migrate to greener pastures. So eventually, some of them walked into the Americas about 30,000 years ago. We're not exactly sure when. Following trails made by mammoths and buffalo and other animals. Today, even still today, conservation groups like ours like to use deer trails as the basis for new hiking trails because they're already there, right? They avoid the bad parts and all. Last year, archaeologists found these fossilized footprints in New Mexico, and they tell us that humans have been hiking in the Americas for 24,000 years. And that's a lot longer than people thought before last year, so we're constantly learning more. Fast forward now to 2,000 years ago. Last week, the speaker was talking about the Hopewell culture. The Hopewell culture had these burial mounds that we found, and archaeologists have found in them items from all across America. In fact, the speaker mentioned that last year. This, if you can see this, the location talks about how into Ohio, right? They were shark teeth from the East Coast, mica from farther down south, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, quartz, galena, grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains, obsidian, and so forth, and they all ended up somehow in this place at about the year 50, right? This is illustrations based on a place in Ohio, but the Norton Mounds in Grand Rapids, the same kind of thing. Okay, so it tells us that these people clearly had trade routes, right, that they would walk that covered large distances. So indigenous North Americans, developed very sophisticated cultures in spite of what people think. This is a depiction of Cahokia, which stood about 7 miles from present-day St. Louis. About 20,000 people lived there. In fact, in the year 2000, it was one of the largest cities in the world, bigger than London, which really wasn't much at the time. And again, climate change, they theorized that climate change is what forced the people to migrate away. Droughts came, and eventually the people migrated into different areas. It was hard for a small area to support that large population, but they were there for 300 or 400 years. The Potawatomi were living in our area when European settlers arrived in the 1600s, 1700s. They were probably not related to the Cahokians, right? They were a different sort of group of people. And as we learned last week again, they lived in centralized villages in the summer, typically at the water's edge. And in the winter, they would follow trails to smaller camps, hunting camps around the area. And there were other trails that would connect different villages together and the different groups together. There were several major trails, Indian trails, when the Europeans arrived here. You can see this blue line that goes up the coast. I kind of faked that one, but there's a map inside that shows a trail that went up the lakeshore and headed up to Mackinac Island, which was a very sacred spot for the Three Nations. There's also, you can see, a purple trail here that followed the Kalamazoo River. And that trail, there are pieces of it, at least the locals, like my friend Jane, claim that that's still a piece of it, the original Indian Trail. Now we have a place called Old Allegan Road, and I think there's some confusion about whether that was an Indian trail or not. I don't think so. I think the Indian Trail went very close to the river, but I haven't been able to find out much fact about that. So in Europe at this time, most people were living in the country, and they worked on farms. The pace of life was very slow, and transportation pretty much meant walking. It may be riding a horse if you were rich or if you had horses on your farm or whatever, but for the most part, it was walking. Walking was humble, and it was often taken as a sign of poverty. The average person had very little interest in hiking for leisure. Right? It just didn't happen. I was going to mention the idea of pilgrimages, right, which were very popular in the Middle Ages, but that wasn't for leisure either. You know, you were doing it because you were representing your village, or you wanted to be cured of something, or whatever. At the end of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution kicked in, and that was a huge impetus for a lot of different things happening related to hiking trails. Lots of people shifted their work from working in the country on farms to working in urban factory jobs. So they not only moved, but they changed the kind of work they were doing. That meant they were spending less time outdoors, and probably they were doing less walking. I was thinking about that the other day. They might have had to walk a long way to get to the factory, I don't know. But they were probably less walking by nature. For a long time, this is something that just blew my mind. This is one of the rabbit holes that blew my mind. For a long time, children as young as 6 could work in factories and mines. There's some amazing, just hair-raising illustrations of children working in mines in Wales, of all places, my old sod. In 1833, God bless them, the British decided that child workers had to be at least 9 years old, unless they worked in a silk mill, and they could be younger still. And in the United States, you're not going to like this one, we didn't have federal child labor laws until 1938. I can't believe it. I imagine there were, social pressures, and there may have been local laws, but there was no federal law against child labor until 1938. Just amazing. Transportation was evolving too. Railroads appeared in the 1800s, the early 1800s, and in 1825 the Erie Canal opened. Now, when I was a kid growing up in New York, right, the Erie Canal was a very big deal when you were learning local history. And what I didn't realize was the Erie Canal basically made it easy for people to get to the Midwest, right? You could take the canal from the Hudson River all the way over to Lake Erie, and then cross Lake Erie, and you're in Detroit, right? So then you just had to get from there. So it meant people could get there more safely and quickly. Now, let's go to the arts a little bit, change the tracks a little bit. The Romantic movement, right, in arts and literature was a reaction to all of this industrialization and this change. One of its characteristics was idealizing nature. And I happen to be a huge fan of Thomas Cole. This painting of his contrasts sunlit farmland on the right, with a storm over the wilderness on the left. Very symbolic, right? And I just love this. But any of you hikers out there, does this remind you of any place? The crow's nest, right? So you're looking down on an oxbow. This was in Massachusetts, but I saw this and I had seen it before, and I just had never made that connection. I just love it. Federal government began selling land in Michigan to settlers in 1818. This map shows Michigan after the treaty, the Treaty of Chicago in 1821. There were several treaties of Chicago, but the one in 1821, right here we are, and this north of here is still Indian land. So that Treaty of 1821, which is where they, unfortunately, sent all of the local natives away, although I believe quite a few Potawatomi stayed here. They chose to stay in residence. At this time, one place I read said it took 3 weeks for an ox-drawn wagon to cross the state. And they were basically following existing trails as they did that. So now they could get to Detroit in a ship, and they could take a wagon across and get to Chicago. Settlers were moving west in large numbers. I'd never seen this painting before, but it's amazing if you can see it closely. It's called American Progress. And there's a floating image of Columbia, the symbol of America. And she's bringing technology and light across the country, while miners and farmers are walking along the trail. And at the time, this was seen as a very positive image, right? The manifest destiny and all, right? But today, right, we think of, some of us would look at this and see indigenous people and buffalo being forced to leave their lands, and I don't actually think that was a great thing. In 1830, the Butler family settled in Saugatuck. And I love this. If you could see, I don't know how well I can't see it from here very well, but I managed to find this photograph, which I think, to me, is kind of how I imagine it. When I read about this, it said the forests were so thick here that you couldn't ride a horse through them, right? You had to walk if you went anywhere. And there's a legend, or a story, that at one time the Butler family decided that they wanted wheat flour. They could only make or get corn flour here, and they wanted wheat flour. And so William walked to Elkhart, Indiana, and back, right? Round trip distance of 150 miles.
Whoa.
Now, I don't know if it's true, but that's the way the story goes. Michigan became the 26th state in 1837. I had fun looking for, part of what was fun putting this together was looking for just the right pictures. And I love that. I used to do presentations all the time as an educator, and part of the fun was just coming up with the right pictures. The following year, right, in 1838, there was a lighthouse in Saugatuck Harbor. It's amazing how fast things developed here. There was no mail service, but there was mail service. I'm not sure how quick it was, but there were no telephones, right? Not yet. If you wanted to get a message to somebody, you pretty much walked to get the message to people. Settlers immediately began logging. And logging, as many of you know, was a huge thing, and still is an important industry in Michigan. In 1871, there were fires all over the Midwest, really big ones in Chicago and Holland, and those things spurred the demand for lumber even greater. Michigan's forests, I read, created more millionaires than the California gold rush, right? And some of those millionaires helped start General Motors and Ford Motor Company, which I found that pretty interesting, the connections there. By 1910, I know Betsy will appreciate it. By 1910, 19.5 million acres of forest were gone. That's about an area about 1/3 the size of the entire state of Michigan. Forests were clear cut; they were gone. I read that evidently clear cutting was popular in Europe, though at the time they knew it was a bad idea, and they still did. People were pretty greedy. We're better about logging today, but in my opinion, and the opinions of several of my friends, we're still way too eager to cut down trees. I'll throw in a little side note here. I don't know how you all feel about the tree by the town hall coming down. I'm not too excited about it. We'll get into that later. So let's get back into some more esoteric things. At this time, there was a philosophy called transcendentalism. What the heck does that have to do with it? There was a philosophy called transcendentalism that was becoming popular, early 1800s. And its followers, among other things, they believed that nature is inherently good and that the divine is here, not far away in heaven. Right? Henry David Thoreau, many of you are familiar with him, was a transcendentalist and an avid hiker. And he wrote this that you see up here. Few people know how to take a walk. The qualifications are endurance, plain clothes, old shoes, an eye for nature, good humor, vast curiosity, good speech, good silence, and nothing much. 1858 or so. That's when he died. That was published in The Atlantic in 1856. Another transcendentalist, James Fenimore Cooper, spent time in Saugatuck very early, so I think it was like the 1840s or something when he was here, gathering notes for his novel, called Oak Openings. Right. The subtitle was The Bee Hunter, right? And he actually, didn't he live in Kalamazoo, I think? He lived in Kalamazoo, but he visited here too. And so you can see on this map, this is where the Oak Openings camp was. This map also, I hadn't seen this anywhere else, shows a trail that went from Singapore, right, the ill-fated city of Singapore, up to Holland. And you can also see, this is the trap, this is going along the lakeside, this is where the Indian Trail supposedly went up to Mackinac Island. The years 1858 to 1871, either side of the Civil War saw some really important arrivals in this area from Chicago. Regular passenger service to Saugatuck and regular train service to New Richmond. Right? So again, it starts to get pretty easy to get here. From New Richmond, you could hike 5 miles to Saugatuck, or you could take a stagecoach. I imagine that probably if you're taking the train up here, you're probably taking the stagecoach. It was so easy to get to Allegan County that the population jumped from 5,000 to 32,000 in that time period. Now, that's not the only reason, right? But I think it's a pretty interesting, coincidence. 1878 saw the first U.S. telephone service. Again, that was a reason. One reason to walk was that you had to get a message to somebody, right? By 1910, there were nearly 6 million phones. That was something that surprised me, how quickly and how early there were lots and lots of phones around. Of course, now there's probably 500 or 700 million phones in the United States. I think there's more than one for every person who lives here, the last time I heard statistics. And so people had one less reason to walk. In the 1890s, automobiles started to appear, and after Ford started mass producing in 1908, things started to really change. Paved roads proliferated, and there was even less need to walk. In the cities, the factories continued to pollute with impunity, and sewage was a real problem. People dreamt of escaping the crowds to open spaces like ours with clean air and water. Wealthy people began building vacation homes, right, in Douglas. They also organized hiking groups, outing groups, like the Sierra Club, which began in 1892. I found it interesting to look at who the members were. They weren't like what you think of as the typical crazy wealthy people. They were college professors and artists, and I think the president of Stanford was one of the original members, and John Muir, some of you are familiar with, right? One of the beginners of the Parks movement, was also one of the early members. And there were other clubs like that that sprang up, but this is like the 1890s that this is happening. As green space shrank in the cities began to create areas like Chicago's Grant Park. And that goes back to 1857. In 1864, Yosemite became the first state park. It even already had a whole set of tourist trails. So that was an integral part of those kinds of parks. 6 years later, Yellowstone became the first national park. And over the next 2 decades, sort of to the end of this century, many state and local parks sprang up, including Mount Baldhead Park. And since 1884, Mount Baldhead Park has been sort of a hub of local hiking activity. So you can see the steps. The steps didn't come until 1931, right? But I believe the picture on the left is a pretty old picture of a kind of a bare dune at Mount Baldhead. There was growing interest in the welfare of working children. Remember, they're pretty young out there working legally. Working children, poor children, and orphans. Settlement houses, right, were one way that people worked against this to alleviate poverty, and they provided services like daycare and all kinds of other things. One of the settlement houses was the Forward Movement Settlement House in Chicago, and they, in 1898, they created the Forward Movement Park in Saugatuck. And among other things, what it helped people among other things, what it did was it got children out of the city, right? They did lots of other things, but that was one of the things that they did. And at the park, people could hike along the Browning path, right? And Browning, again, was a transcendentalist. In fact, there are several places in the park that were named after transcendentalists. So George Washington Gray, I think, was a big fan of those folks. Wasn't he? He was a Methodist minister, wasn't he? Originally, Presbyterian, and then he went from one to the other or something. By 1918, now I'm really into the whole idea of summer camps. I worked at the summer camps when I was a kid, and I just think summer camps are wonderful. And by 1918, right, we had those camps like the Forward Movement that were starting early on. But by 1918, there were 1,000 summer camps, and I think probably by 1930 there were probably 10,000. I couldn't find a statistic for that, but I know that in the 20s there were a lot of summer camps. The one that I worked at started in 1920. Openings opened in 1923, so it was part of a huge movement for summer camp kinds of things. Forward Movement Park evolved eventually through Camp Gray to the Presbyterian camp, which closed, which was sold in 2014. Most of the land is now in private hands, but a few of the hiking trails are still accessible to the public. So this trail up here, some of you are familiar with the Woolham Trail, right? That was a trail that was one of the trails that was part of the Presbyterian camp. And it goes down here. If any of you hike in there, sometimes you see the signs with the green stripe on them. I call that the green trail. The rest of it goes into private land over here. And then there's a yellow trail over here that's not real well marked, but it still exists. And those were from the Presbyterian camp. I'm going to cover this while I go back.
That's now part of Saugatuck City property.
Right. North and east of this purple line, north of Perryman, is all city property. South of there is all private, pretty much private. There's a right-of-way, I think, for the trail south of there. And to be honest, that privatization was one of the main things that got me interested in the Riverwood Council, in this idea of conserving land. There are so many places that are just beautiful, and I think if we're not careful, if we don't pay attention, we're just going to let it all get developed and into little tiny lots with no trees, and eventually it'll be like a suburb here, and people will not be happy. It'll sort of creep up, and before long, enough preaching.
No, more preaching.
More preaching.
More preaching.
Okay. So there are other public. Pardon me. I'm talking to the choir. Maybe not all of you, but I think a lot of kindred spirits out here. The other public trails in our area came about in all kinds of ways. Between 1898 and 1926, I got really interested in this a long time ago. The interurban electric train went from Saugatuck up to Holland. That story to me is another fascinating story. And part of the abandoned route of that train now is a little trail through Peterson Preserve in Saugatuck. You can also see traces of the interurban on a couple of other trails. If you've ever been to Farview Park, it's north of where Guardian Brewing is. It's a Lake Town Township Park. It crosses the power line, right, which is basically the route of the interurban. And in Sanctuary Woods, up near Holland, you can see a bridge that was part of the interurban. In 1929, as we all know, the stock market crashed. Right? Within four years, 20% of Americans were out of work. That was a big deal. One of the solutions, one of the ways that people combated that was creating a voluntary work program called the Civilian Conservation Corps, right, the CCC. I haven't found a lot of CCC evidence in this area. Now, I may be wrong, but there's nothing wrong with that. But over the 10 years that the CCC was around, I found statistics that said 100,000 young men, just in Michigan, 100,000 young men, over 100,000, worked for the CCC in Michigan, and they planted nearly, get this, 500 million trees in Michigan. They also built trails and worked on parks like Isle Royal, right, and Ludington. So the CCC was a good thing for hikers. The nature of work was changing, and some of that had to do with the Depression. For a long time, people worked 6 days, right? They worked from Monday to Saturday. Sunday was off, the church, all the different churches, nope, gotta have Sunday off. Some workers believed they deserved another day off, so they took Mondays. And I thought this was kind of an interesting little phenomenon. Evidently, the employers tolerated this thing. It was called Saint Monday. Like you're taking a Saint's Day off, and it was Saint Monday. And evidently, lots of employers just sort of looked the other way and said, okay, stay home on Monday. Again, it wasn't until 1838 that U.S. workers were guaranteed a 2-day weekend. And one of the places that started it earlier, Ford, I think in 1926, started giving a 2-day weekend. So really, everybody was working 6 days a week until not that long ago, right? Paid vacations were starting to become common at the time as well. After World War II, the GI Bill made a college education accessible to millions of people, and that, again, is changing the nature of work a lot. Businesses boomed, houses became affordable, and superhighways were built. For the first time, lots of Americans had spending money and time to go hiking. But most of them got into cars and went to campgrounds, or they went to tourist sites. I don't remember as a kid lots of people going places to go hiking. I'm sure they were doing it, but it wasn't happening in huge numbers, as far as I know. With more cars, trucks, and buses on the roads, right, the use of railroads declined, unfortunately, right? I wish we still had good local train service. When we lived in South Bend, it was great. We could take the South Shore, which was an interurban, all the way to Chicago, and it was a great bargain. Somewhat of passenger service, as a reference point, passenger service to Fenville, which started in 1871, ended in the 60s. It came back for one weekend a year for a little while after that, but no more. Some wonderful people, though, started looking at these abandoned rail lines and decided they would make great trails, right? So south of us, some of you may be familiar with the Calhaven Trail. That was a line that was abandoned in 1970 and became a rail trail in 1989, fairly early. And in fact, Michigan, handy factoid, has over 2,300 miles of rail trails, the most in the United States. Good for us. We're a very hike-friendly state, I gotta say. In the workplace, sedentary work increased 83% between 1950 and 2010. So, right, a lot of people began sitting down on the job. Right? Only 15% of Americans I read today spend any time outdoors on the job. Right? 15% on the job, and actually, most of those 15% are in trucks. So they're really not what I would call outdoors. Right? They're outside of a building, but they're in a truck. Nearly half of us spend no more than 30 minutes a day outdoors. That's barely enough time for a 1 mile hike. Come on, right? We gotta get out more than that. Information technologies like what I used to work with have developed exponentially, as you all know, since the war. A lot of workers spend their time looking at a screen, working with information, and maybe as a result of that, or partly, interest in hiking has really grown in the last 20 or 30 years. A recent survey indicated that 19% of Americans participate in hiking. That's a lot of people. That's 1 in 5. There are now, here's another factoid for you, there are more than 13,000 miles of trails in Michigan. 13,000 miles, that's a lot, but it's not as much as a lot of other places. That's one reason why we have great places to hike around here, like these places. These 4 local trails are the result of conservation efforts. The Wade Nature Preserve, right? I think that one dates back to 1980, if I'm not mistaken. And Wakina were both donated to land conservancies, right? Wakina, the William Irby Smith Preserve on Lakeshore, right? Talmadge Woods, right, was handed over to the Land Conservancy of West Michigan after Oxbow couldn't afford the taxes, I think is what I read.
No, they didn't pay any taxes on it.
Well,
It was part of the school.
And Saugatuck Harbor Natural Area was purchased with all kinds of funding, right? Grants, donations, all kinds of stuff. So we have some really amazing spots to go hiking in our area. Why would you want to go hiking? Well, let me get on my soapbox. I think it's like a wonder drug that helps you live longer. Right? It's good for your heart, it's good for your bones, it's good for your lungs. Right? Glenna? Yeah. It improves your sleep. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And enhances your mood. It fights arthritis and mental decline. It's also beneficial for people with type 2 diabetes. I mean, a wonder drug, right? I'm sure this doesn't apply to anyone here, but you might also lose a little weight. Looking to the future, this is the vision of a proposed 11-mile trail that would go from the historic New Richmond Bridge to Saugatuck Dunes State Park. Parts of it exist right now, and a few others are in the works. If this will ever become reality, it's going to take years. And any help that you all want to give to us in making that happen would be awesome. This paper map, which you can pick up, shows dozens of beautiful trails that are already in our area that you can hike, including the extensive network of trails in the Saugatuck Peninsula. Right, so natural area, right? Oxbow, or my favorite, the Crow's Nest Trail, and then there are a few in here that a lot of people are not aware of. All kinds of little hikes. We're trying to get Saugatuck City to actually bless them and recognize them and make them official and so forth. But the hiking club website, and if you're interested in this, it's simply radarhill.club. Radarhill.club. Radar Hill is just another name for Mount Baldhead. Right? So radarhill.club. There's information on all kinds of trails in the area. Trails are a great start, right? Trails are good. But we need to do a lot more to preserve the natural area around us. And that really is my main motivation for talking about this and promoting hiking, is that we need to do what we can to preserve these natural areas. On an economic level, people come here expecting green space, not suburbs, right? So we really want to make sure that we keep that feel, the rural feel of this area. Wild animals like deer, right, need contiguous trail spaces, right, open spaces to flourish. Our ecosystem needs more trees, not fewer trees, if we're going to be able to fight climate change. And one thing you can do, here's my plug again, is support the work of groups like the Riverwood Council. There are other groups, but that happens to be my particular